The American Civil War, widely known in the United States as simply the Civil War as well as other sectional names, was a civil war fought from 1861 to 1865 to determine the survival of the Union or independence for the Confederacy. Among the 34 states in January 1861, 7 Southern slave states individually declared their secession from the United States and formed the Confederate States of America. The Confederacy, often simply called the South, grew to include 11 states, and although they claimed 13 states and additional Western territories, the Confederacy was never diplomatically recognized by any foreign country. The states that remained loyal and did not declare secession were known as the Union or the North. The war had its origin in the factious issue of slavery, especially the extension of slavery into the Western territories. After 4 years of combat, which had left over 600,000 Union and Confederate soldiers dead and had destroyed much of the South's infrastructure, the Confederacy collapsed and slavery was abolished. Then began the Reconstruction and the processes of restoring national unity and guaranteeing civil rights to the freed slaves. In the 1860 presidential election, Republicans, led by Abraham Lincoln, supported banning slavery in all the U.S. territories, something the Southern states viewed as a violation of their constitutional rights and as being part of a plan to eventually abolish slavery. The Republican Party, dominant in the North, secured a majority of the electoral votes, and Lincoln was elected the first Republican president. But before his inauguration, 7 slave states with cotton-based economies formed the Confederacy. The first 6 to secede had the highest proportions of slaves in the populations, a total of 48.8%. 8 remaining slave states continued to reject calls for secession. Outgoing Democratic President James Buchanan and the incoming Republicans rejected secession as illegal. Lincoln's March 4, 1861 inaugural address declared his administration would not initiate civil war. Speaking directly to the Southern states, he reaffirmed, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the United States where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." Confederate forces seized numerous federal forts within territory claimed by the Confederacy. Efforts at compromise failed, and both sides prepared for war. The Confederates assumed that European countries were so dependent on King Cotton that they would intervene. None did, and none recognized the new Confederate States of America. Hostilities began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces fired upon Fort Sumter. While in the Western Theater the Union made significant permanent gains, in the Eastern Theater, battle was inconclusive in 1861–62. The autumn 1862 Confederate campaigns into Maryland and Kentucky failed, dissuading British intervention. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which made ending slavery a war goal. To the west, by summer 1862 the Union destroyed the Confederate River Navy, then much of their western armies, and seized New Orleans. The 1863 Union siege of Vicksburg split the Confederacy in two at the Mississippi River. In 1863, Robert E. Lee's Confederate incursion north ended at the Battle of Gettysburg. Western successes led to Ulysses S. Grant's command of all Union armies in 1864, inflicting an ever-tightening naval blockade of Confederate ports. The Union marshaled the resources and manpower to attack the Confederacy from all directions, leading to the fall of Atlanta to William T. Sherman and his march to the sea. The last significant battles raged around the siege of Petersburg. Lee's escape attempt ended with his surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. While the military war was coming to an end, the political reintegration of the nation was to take another 12 years of the Reconstruction era. The American Civil War was one of the earliest true industrial wars. Railroads, the telegraph, steamships, and mass-produced weapons were employed extensively. The mobilization of civilian factories, mines, shipyards, banks, transportation and food supplies all foreshadowed the impact of industrialization in World War I. It remains the deadliest war in American history. From 1861 to 1865, about 750,000 soldiers died, along with an undetermined number of civilians. By one estimate, the war claimed the lives of 10% of all Northern males 20 to 45 years old, and 30% of all Southern white males aged 18 to 40. Causes of secession. The causes of the Civil War were complex and have been controversial since the war began. James C. Bradford wrote that the issue has been further complicated by historical revisionists, who have tried to offer a variety of reasons for the war. Slavery was the central source of escalating political tension in the 1850s. The Republican Party was determined to prevent any spread of slavery, and many Southern leaders had threatened secession if the Republican candidate, Lincoln, won the 1860 election. After Lincoln won without carrying a single Southern state, many Southern whites felt that disunion had become their only option, because they thought that they were losing representation, which would hamper their ability to promote pro-slavery acts and policies. Root causes: slavery. Contemporary actors. The Union and Confederate leadership and fighting soldiers on both sides believed that slavery caused the Civil War. Union men mainly believed the war was to emancipate the slaves. Confederates fought to protect Southern society, and slavery is an integral part of it. From the anti-slavery perspective, the issue was primarily about whether the system of slavery was an anachronistic evil that was incompatible with republicanism in the United States. The strategy of the anti-slavery forces was containment, to stop the expansion and thus put slavery on a path to gradual extinction. The slave-holding interests in the South denounced this strategy as infringing upon their constitutional rights. Southern whites believed that the emancipation of slaves would destroy the South's economy because of the alleged laziness of blacks under free labor. Slavery was illegal in the North. It was fading in the border states and in southern cities, but was expanding in the highly profitable cotton districts of the South and Southwest. Subsequent writers on the American Civil War looked to several factors explaining the geographic divide, including sectionalism, protectionism and states' rights. Sectionalism. Sectionalism refers to the different economies, social structure, customs and political values of the North and South. It increased steadily between 1800 and 1860 as the North, which phased slavery out of existence, industrialized, urbanized and built prosperous farms, while the Deep South concentrated on plantation agriculture based on slave labor, together with subsistence farming for the poor whites. In the 1840s and 50s, the issue of accepting slavery split the nation's largest religious denominations into separate Northern and Southern denominations. Historians have debated whether economic differences between the industrial Northeast and the agricultural South helped cause the war. Most historians now disagree with the economic determinism of historian Charles A. Beard in the 1920s and emphasize that Northern and Southern economies were largely complementary. While socially different, the sections economically benefited each other. Protectionism. Historically, Southern slaveholding states, because of their low-cost manual labor, had little perceived need for mechanization, and supported having the right to sell cotton and purchase manufactured goods from any nation. Northern states, which had heavily invested in their still nascent manufacturing, could not compete with the full-fledged industries of Europe in offering high prices for cotton imported from the South and low prices for manufactured exports in return. Thus, Northern manufacturing interests supported tariffs and protectionism while Southern planters demanded free trade. The Democrats in Congress, controlled by Southerners, wrote the tariff laws in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, and kept reducing rates so that the 1857 rates were the lowest since 1816. The Whigs and Republicans complained because they favored high tariffs to stimulate industrial growth, and Republicans called for an increase in tariffs in the 1860 election. The increases were only enacted in 1861 after Southerners resigned their seats in Congress. The tariff issue was and is sometimes cited long after the war by lost cause historians and neo-Confederate apologists. In 1860–61, none of the groups that proposed compromises to head off secession raised the tariff issue. Pamphleteers North and South rarely mentioned the tariff, and when some did, for instance, Matthew Fontaine Maury and John Lothrop Motley, they were generally writing for a foreign audience. States' rights. The South argued that each state had the right to secede, leave the Union at any time, that the Constitution was a compact, or agreement among the states. Northerners rejected that notion as opposed to the will of the Founding Fathers, who said they were setting up a perpetual union. Historian James McPherson writes, concerning states' rights and other non-slavery explanations, while one or more of these interpretations remain popular among the sons of Confederate veterans and other Southern heritage groups, few professional historians now subscribe to them. Of all these interpretations, the states' rights argument is perhaps the weakest. It fails to ask the question, states' rights for what purpose? States' rights, or sovereignty, was always more a means than an end, an instrument to achieve a certain goal more than a principle. Territorial crisis. Between 1803 and 1854, the United States achieved a vast expansion of territory through purchase, negotiation, and conquest. At first, the new states carved out of these territories entering the Union were apportioned equally between slave and free states. It was over territories west of the Mississippi that the pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces collided. With the conquest of northern Mexico west to California in 1848, slaveholding interests looked forward to expanding into these lands and perhaps Cuba and Central America as well. Northern Free Soil interests vigorously sought to curtail any further expansion of slave soil. The Compromise of 1850 over California balanced a free soil state with stronger fugitive slave laws for a political settlement after 4 years of strife in the 1840s. But the states admitted following California were all free soil: Minnesota, Oregon and Kansas. In the southern states, the question of the territorial expansion of slavery westward again became explosive. Both the South and the North drew the same conclusion. The power to decide the question of slavery for the territories was the power to determine the future of slavery itself. By 1860, 4 doctrines had emerged to answer the question of federal control in the territories, and they all claimed they were sanctioned by the Constitution, implicitly or explicitly. The first of these, conservative theories, represented by the Constitutional Union Party, argued that the Missouri Compromise apportionment of territory north for free soil and south for slavery should become a constitutional mandate. The Crittenden Compromise of 1860 was an expression of this view. The second doctrine of congressional preeminence, championed by Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party, insisted that the Constitution did not bind legislators to a policy of balance, that slavery could be excluded in a territory as it was done in the Northwest Ordinance at the discretion of Congress. Thus Congress could restrict human bondage, but never establish it. The Wilmot Proviso announced this position in 1846. Senator Stephen A. Douglas proclaimed the doctrine of territorial or popular sovereignty, which declared that the settlers in a territory had the same rights as states in the Union to establish or disestablish slavery as a purely local matter. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 legislated this doctrine. In Kansas Territory, Years of pro- and anti-slavery violence and political conflict erupted. The Congressional House of Representatives voted to admit Kansas as a free state in early 1860. But its admission in the Senate was delayed until January 1861, after the 1860 elections, when Southern senators began to leave. The fourth theory was advocated by Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis, one of state sovereignty, also known as the Calhoun Doctrine, named after the South Carolinian political theorist and statesman John C. Calhoun, rejecting the arguments for federal authority or self-government. State sovereignty would empower states to promote the expansion of slavery as part of the federal union under the U.S. Constitution. States as rights was an ideology formulated and applied as a means of advancing slave state interests through federal authority. As historian Thomas L. Cranawiter points out, the Southern demand for federal slave protection represented a demand for an unprecedented expansion of federal power. These four doctrines comprised the major ideologies presented to the American public on the matters of slavery, the territories and the U.S. Constitution prior to the 1860 presidential election, national elections beginning in the American Revolution and accelerating after the War of 1812. The people of the United States grew in their sense of country as an important example to the world of a national republic of political liberty and personal rights. Previous regional independence movements such as the Greek Revolt in the Ottoman Empire, division and redivision in the Latin American political map, and the British-French Crimean triumph leading to an interest in redrawing Europe along cultural differences, all conspired to make for a time of upheaval and uncertainty about the basis of the nation-state. In the world of 19th-century self-made Americans, growing in prosperity, population, and expanding westward, freedom could mean personal liberty or property rights. The unresolved difference would cause failure, first in the political institutions, then in their civil life together. Nationalism and honor. Nationalism was a powerful force in the early 19th century, with famous spokesmen such as Andrew Jackson and Daniel Webster. While practically all Northerners supported the Union, Southerners were split between those loyal to the entire United States and those loyal primarily to the Southern region and then the Confederacy. C. Van Woodward said of the latter group, the Great Slave Society had grown up and miraculously flourished in the heart of a thoroughly bourgeois and partly puritanical republic. It had renounced its bourgeois origins and elaborated and painfully rationalized its institutional, legal, metaphysical, and religious defenses. When the crisis came, it chose to fight. It proved to be the death struggle of a society, which went down in ruins. Perceived insults to Southern collective honor included the enormous popularity of Uncle Tom's Cabin and the actions of abolitionist John Brown in trying to incite a slave rebellion in 1859. While the South moved toward a Southern nationalism, leaders in the North were also becoming more nationally minded, and rejected any notion of splitting the Union. The Republican National Electoral Platform of 1860 warned that Republicans regarded disunion as treason and would not tolerate it. We denounce those threats of disunion as denying the vital principles of a free government, and as an avowal of contemplated treason, which it is the imperative duty of an indignant people sternly to rebuke and forever silence. The South ignored the warnings. Southerners did not realize how ardently the North would fight to hold the Union together. Lincoln's election. The election of Lincoln in November 1860 was the final trigger for secession. Efforts at compromise, including the Corwin Amendment and the Crittenden Compromise, failed. Southern leaders feared that Lincoln would stop the expansion of slavery and put it on a course toward extinction. The slave states, which had already become a minority in the House of Representatives, were now facing a future as a perpetual minority in the Senate and Electoral College against an increasingly powerful North. Before Lincoln took office in March 1861, 7 slave states had declared their secession and joined to form the Confederacy.